you say the core samples, but actually they're in sediment samples. So what we do is take a block sample in the field with a north arrow marked on it on a flat surface. We know its latitude and longitude, so we know its absolute orientation. We bring it back to the lab, preserve that orientation, and then in what's called a spinner magnetometer that has 3 little fluxgate magnetometers around it, you spin it and you find out the phase of the magnetic vector. You then rotate it 90 degrees, you rotate it 90 degrees, you measure it 6 times, and you work out the average magnetic vector in it. You then demagnetize it, because you can have a late magnetic field imposed on it through weathering and so on, even quite a distance below the surface. You demagnetize it first at about 50 oersted and then 100 and 150. You measure these things, they take forever, but 20 times or so. If you're still not satisfied, you can demagnetize them instead of using alternating frequency demagnetization. You can demagnetize them thermally, which works differently because it destroys certain minerals at certain temperatures. So you have 3 kinds of samples. Those that are very, very easy to interpret, those that are completely uninterpretable, and then the really hard ones where you think you know what's going on but are not sure.
This question's for Dr. Tarico. I was just curious, you described yourself as a former evangelical Christian. Was curious what led you away from that part of your life and what you did with the church while you were still in it.
You know, my first qualms about my first struggles with what I had been taught actually came clear back in grade school. I had a Mormon friend, Kay, who was a really good person, and I was just struggling with the fact that she was going to be tortured forever, and I was going to be blissfully happy while that was happening. And I would say that kind of question was one that in a more elaborate kind of, elaborated, intellectually elaborated way, continued to be one that I never resolved. But I was a pretty slow study on this. I managed to make it all the way through Wheaton College of Billy Graham fame and all the way through graduate school, evolving a more and more idiosyncratic form of faith, trying to hold together the rational and moral contradictions. And the final straw was working at Children's Hospital in Seattle, where I was helping families with kids who were dying of cancer, and listening to people around me struggle to justify that in the context of their belief in a all-loving, all perfectly good interventionist God. And the justification sounded so hollow to me because they didn't make it just. Right? None of them worked to make it fair, and I finally got angry at that God in my head and said, I'm not making excuses for you anymore, I'm done. And all I had left was excuses. And then I just walked away and I didn't really think about it much for the next almost 20 years until George Bush started turning evangelical theology into public policy, which was killing people, literally. And as I said today, I've become increasingly focused on the consequences related to women's health because again, we have biblical religion very clearly killing people around the world. The woman who died recently in Ireland was just an isolated and dramatic example of that.
Are there other religions? Have you studied in which this patriarchy is corresponds with this the coming about of writing? You mentioned communication and how things kind of got solidified in the Bible. Is it also true with other religions around the axial age?
I am not an expert on that. I have read other writers, other scholars who have suggested that actually that the fundamentalism, if you will, around the world has followed literacy, which is a somewhat painful thought simply because we like to think that literacy only brings good things, right? But really, Karen Armstrong's work on this subject would suggest that there is the way that American Christians treat the Bible and the way that the unique status that it is accorded, and the way that then it becomes a substitute for other kinds of authority or other kinds of inquiry is unique to people having access to the written word. And in fact, what you see, like I spent some time not long ago in Madagascar, and it gave me a real appreciation for why, in fact, why the literacy would make that kind of Bible worship, or that kind of particular form of Christianity, I guess, so transmissible, because it allows anybody to be an expert, right? So you had these villagers in Madagascar who had very little access to information, but they had been subject to missionary conversions and provided with Bibles, and then you would have one person in the village who could read that Bible and then interpret it through prayer, and it allows this. It's a kind of power that's hard to match.
Hi, my question is actually for Frank. Just like she's talking about the glass wall that people have about they're chained to the Bible morally. Obviously, a lot of people are chained to the Bible scientifically, like their worldview is stuck in the Iron Age. Their view of science is stuck in the Iron Age, and you're a professor and you have been educating for a lot of years. And when you come across people who have that glass wall built up around them, how do you deal with that?
Well, that's a difficult one. Do you mean if I come across a professor who is like that, or if I come across a student who's like that? Students are educable. I'm not sure that professors are. There seems to be, amongst people who are actually quite gifted at scientific and technical fields, there are some who believe, for example, that the Earth is 6,000 years old or so, right? Some people will say it's 13,000 because a day is 1,000 years in the eye of the Lord, and so on. The fact that they cannot accept they cannot accept scientific evidence on this one question is simply, I don't understand, it's some sort of compartmentalization, a partitioning, like you partition the hard memory in a computer. It's a partition, and you never cross it. There's no point in arguing it, because you cannot make any headway. So, you live with it. They're very decent people. They're extremely good at what they do. If they believe something, they believe as strongly that I am a complete idiot for thinking that the Earth is very old, but I think there's good scientific evidence for it. I think they're complete idiots on that point for thinking it's very young. And so we agree to disagree. With students, you can, because I think their minds are still more agile and less fixed, you can often very gently show them the way and why they should believe that the Earth is very old. And for one example, the time one is the big one. It's the hardest thing for people to accept, that the Earth is so much older than humanity itself. And yet I think it's simply good proof that it took God a long time to build the Earth to make it suitable for man, you know?
I've done a lot of research here at WSU, including some field research. And with that, I know there's a lot of hiccups that come with it. And so I was just wondering if you could share your story of one of your biggest hiccups with your research.
Biggest hiccups? Well, I've certainly had, I was talking to Jim on the way down here from Spokane. I certainly have nightmares all the time that maybe something is wrong. Before Kenyanthropus was published, we had a tuff that was helping control the age of Kenyanthropus. And the Nature manuscript was written, it was ready to go to press, and I woke up in a cold sweat at about 2 in the morning, and I thought, my God, there is one other tough that it just could be, and that's 1.5 million years old. And I drug myself out of bed and went up to school and pulled all of the data and put them in one place, and I sorted and sorted. I couldn't split these apart. Then I sorted by manganese, and bing, they were separate, and I knew we were okay. So that's not a glitch. We do make glitches. We make glitches all the time. And what you must do when you make a glitch, particularly if you're going to be in the sciences, you best find it and fix it before somebody else does, because somebody else certainly will.
I read a theory recently that a lot of the biblical attitude towards women were a direct reaction towards female religions of the time. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that idea. Like, have you heard of that? Do you think that is possible, that a lot of the patriarchal attitudes were a reaction against matriarchy?
I don't know enough about the evolution of ancient culture to comment on that. My suspicion is that it evolved slowly enough that it wasn't a direct and clear reaction specifically to the worship of female gods. Yahweh himself appears to have been early on a tribal war god, so that the emergence of patriarchal religion predates the early Hebrew religion and the emergence of Yahweh worship.
Yeah, I'd like to direct a question to both, actually. For reasons I've never been able to understand myself, I've always had a bias towards science and a certain amount of antagonism, I guess I would say, towards religion. Although, reading that some 90% of American citizens describe themselves as religious, I think in most cases with a much more benign view of religion than Dr. Tarico presented. But worldwide, essentially all the world religions are very patriarchal. I think what you said about Christianity can be said about virtually all world religions. And the question in this hoped-for era of enlightenment and improved communication, is there really a likelihood that will really change worldwide?
That's a very difficult question. I would hope that would be the case. Being a realist, though, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. I'm 70 years old this year. So, no, I won't see it. Maybe some of the younger people here will. A difficulty, I think, if we could change one thing, I have a very strange family history. My grandfather was told by a Catholic priest, give us a child until he's 7 and he is ours. And my grandfather, being a mean old cuss, said, well, then my kids won't go to church until they're 12 if they want to. So they didn't. And my parents told me the same thing, and I told my kids the same thing. My daughters did want to, they were very curious. They were in a fairly strongly religious community in Salt Lake City. They did want to go to church because all the friends went to church. And they said, do you mind if we go with Melissa across the street? I said, no problem. Going off to church. Because I always did something with the girls on Sundays. We'd go to the zoo or the museum or something. And when they got back, I said, well, how did you like it? And all that my older daughter said was, can we go to the zoo next Sunday?
Futurist Sarah Robinson wrote an article last fall, I think, that's actually worth Googling. I think the title was Why Patriarchal Men Are Terrified of Birth Control and Why We'll Still Be Fighting About It 100 years from now. And the point that she made, as somebody who takes a very long-range perspective, is that she would argue that contraception is the most disruptive technology of the last 100 years. And that if, in fact, maybe of the last several thousand years, because if you look at our humanity's history, all of our cultural agreements, the kind of norms and traditions and roles and rituals are structured around the fact that was inescapable until very recently that women had no control over their fertility. And the pill changed that. It was the first time that women actually had a relatively reliable kind of contraception, and that was even with 1 in 12 women gets pregnant every year on the pill. With the new methods, it's 1 in 500 or less. So it's gotten even more dramatic. But the fact is that we've got all of these norms, habits, patterns, rituals, whatever you want to call them, that are structured around that not being the case. And that is an immensely threatening thing. And if you think about what religion is a way of encoding and scripting those cultural agreements. And what then what it does is it actually removes the original rationale, so that you can't even sometimes tell what the original rationale is. I'm reminded of the joke of the woman who said to her mother, "Why do you cut both ends off the pot roast before you put it in the pan?" And her mother says, "Well, I don't know. That's just the way we do it. That's the way my mother always taught me to do it." And so the next time she sees her grandmother, she says, "Grandmother, I just got curious last time I was making a pot roast. Why do you cut both ends off before you put it in the pan?" And her grandmother looked at her and said, "Because the only pan I had was so small, that's the only way it would fit in." What happens once culture becomes religion is that we forget why it came to be the way it was in the first place, and then it just becomes really hard to unwind it. And but I actually do have some hope, because I think that having tasted freedom, people are going to keep fighting this fight, and until we win.
I hope you're right.
This is for Dr. Tarico. How do you think the world will react to male birth control? How do you think that's going to play into the fight in the future?
I think that the big funders of contraception have neglected male birth control to their detriment, because I think that when guys can't have control over their own fertility, with a long-acting reversible method that they don't have to think about in the moment, that doesn't mean they have to give up their virility long term, that they are going to want it, especially in cultures where we now have the legal, the kind of scientific means to obligate men to take care of their offspring. I mean, if I was the mother of sons instead of daughters, I would be terrified of sending them out into the world knowing that women can just lie to them about whether they're contracepting, and knowing that condoms, that people get pregnant on condoms at a rate that's somewhat worse than 1 in 10 per year. So I actually think that when men have control over their fertility, that the conversation is going to change in a big way.
Thanks so much for coming out. We hope to see you guys tomorrow night. Friday night, we're supporting the Rendezvous in the Park fundraiser. And then Saturday, we hope to see you all at the University of Idaho campus for Julia Sweeney. And again, thank you for coming out.